Star Trek Picard has ended its first season run on CBS All Access, and it's time for me to give my thoughts. Did I like it? Did it keep me engaged? We'll find out right now. Hey everybody, I'm Dan Murrell. Welcome to my review / breakdown of Season 1 of Star Trek Picard. As I mentioned in the video, to launch this channel, one of the few things that most people know about me is that I am a massive Star Trek fan. I love Star Trek so much, I helped write a whole honest trailer for Star Trek The Next Generation, which you can check out right now. It's a lot of fun. I love that trailer. When I heard that they were bringing back Captain Picard, who for my money is the best Star Trek captain of all the Star Trek captains, I was excited, but also, I gotta be honest, a little worried, because that character and that show, particularly Star Trek The Next Generation, I thought were done so well. And even in the worst movie iterations of Star Trek, they still handled the characters pretty well.
Serving with you has been an honor. The honor was mine.
A lot of times people ask, what is Star Trek? I think it's a question that Star Trek fans themselves ask each other. And it's largely because Star Trek has been so many different things over the years. The 60s TV show obviously has the big, deep, philosophical episodes.
Do you know what you just did? He knows, Doctor. He knows.
But they also have episodes where, like, you're taking out Spock's brain.
His brain is gone.
There's one with, like, Jack the Ripper. There's one where they're getting sprayed with hippie flowers. Like, the 60s TV show has so many crazy things going on. They're not all cities on the edges of forever. Even when you go to The Next Generation, which I think is considered by most people to be a more serious quote-unquote show, you have the best of both worlds, and you have the very philosophical episodes like The Measure of a Man, which introduced a character that appears in this show, in Dr. Bruce Maddox.
Data must not be permitted to resign.
Data is a Starfleet officer. He still has certain rights.
Right. I'm sick to death of hearing about rights.
But you also have, like, a fistful of Datas where they're in a Western and Data's, like, running around in a buxom saloon lady uniform. Even inside of itself, The Next Generation was a bunch of different things. But every iteration of Star Trek, or I think at least the classical iterations of Star Trek, have one thing in common, and it really does go back to Gene Roddenberry's original vision for what the future is going to be, which is that it is a time of hope. It is a time of optimism. It is a time where if humanity and the galaxy at large hasn't overcome all of the obstacles that face it, it's at least working to overcome those obstacles. As a matter of fact, the idea that humanity is flawed is what the entire series of Star Trek The Next Generation is based on. Humanity is literally placed on trial by the Q continuum.
Are you certain you want a full disclosure of human ugliness? So be it, fool.
And each time, Captain Picard, through his actions and the actions of his crew, proves that humanity is worth saving and that humanity is advancing towards a brighter future.
We've passed your little test.
Temper, mon capitaine.
Get off my ship.
One thing that I didn't really have a huge problem with was the premise of the show. And I've heard a lot of people saying that it's too pessimistic, or the idea that because of this attack by synthetic life at Utopia Planitia on Mars, the Federation turning their back on the Romulan rescue mission, that hews too far from the idealism of the future, that it doesn't seem like that's something that the Federation would do. But I think that is actually sort of necessary for establishing the stakes of this show, because I like that in the beginning and really throughout the show, Captain Picard is that one true north for what the Federation should and shouldn't be doing. I think that's very true to his character. He was always somebody who stood up, even oftentimes in the face of Starfleet, to say, no, I don't care about your rules and regulations. This is wrong.
Admiral, what you're doing here is unethical. It's immoral. I'll fight it.
So I do think that there's room for darkness. I do think that there's room for conflict inside this brighter, optimistic future. And the setup of the show, for me, didn't violate that spirit of Trek. I was at least willing to go on this journey and see what was going to happen.
Why did you really quit Starfleet?
Because it was no longer Starfleet.
From there, I think, is where you see the show really trying to wrestle with itself and figure out what it wants to be, and staying true to Star Trek, but also in establishing itself as a grittier version than we've seen before in this franchise. Maybe this goes back to what Patrick Stewart himself said he wanted out of the show, which is a show that was exactly what people remember, but also something that was completely different from what they would expect. That's a pretty tall order, but that's a struggle that I see happening through many episodes of the show. If you haven't seen Picard and you don't want to know anything about what happens beyond the premise, then from here on out, we're going to get a little bit deeper into the plot, and then I'm going to go into real spoilers at the end of the review. I'll let you know before that happens as well. Where I think Picard really begins to struggle is as it goes beneath the initial premise, which is the fact that Picard, haunted by the death of his friend Data, wants to seek out this legacy of his. All of this stuff makes sense to me. Where it starts to kind of groan is this addition of layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of additional mythology. Not only are you involving the Romulan secret police, the Tal Shiar, but inside the Romulan secret police, you also have this secret cabal called the Zhat Vash, and then you have this fighting force of trained Romulan nuns. It really doesn't add a whole lot other than adding layers and layers of complication to justify more and more scenes of exposition, and the more you get into the weeds with that, the further I think you get from the core of the story. Even when you look at the characters themselves, I like most of the characters in the show, but the show then spends so much time establishing these deep, dark wells of pain in their past. Even returning characters like Riker and Troy, not only are they camped out on this forest planet, but they've got a dead kid that they're still mourning over. I think that adding a tragic backstory for every single character in the show is kind of a cheap and easy way to get the audience to sympathize with them, when you could maybe take a little more time, write some stories that allow you to naturally root for these characters instead of sort of forcing that emotion by taking these shortcuts. And speaking of shortcuts, there is one thing that the show does. As I mentioned, I don't mind that we are in kind of a darker, grittier era of the Federation and Starfleet than we've seen before. But I do have a problem with the show deciding to just drop F-bombs into just random conversations and random parts of the show. I was like, I'm not a prude. I don't mind language. But we are talking about a little bit more of an evolved society.
Have you found them?
Yes, they will here.
Any of them?
Admiral Picard, with all due respect and at long last, shut the up.
You all are the closest I've come in a long time, maybe ever, to having a crew. Sorry, I had to ruin it.
Michael Chabon gave an interview where he said that the reason people didn't swear in Star Trek wasn't that they didn't want to, but it was because the writers were censored and the FCC wouldn't allow it. I don't necessarily feel like that's the case. Yes, they've used language before, but here's the difference between where Star Trek has used language and where they haven't used language. Double dumbass on you. Kirk didn't just say that in Star Trek 4, he said it as an example of how he doesn't know how to use profanity.
Why do you watch where you're going, you dumbass? Well, a double dumbass on you!
Data saying "oh shit" in Star Trek Generations was not only a joke, but also underlined the fact that this is a pretty bad situation. When the android is at a loss for words, you know things are going badly. It's not necessarily that they used the language, is that it was just kind of peppered in for no reason whatsoever. Now, I talk about the shortcuts they make with a lot of the backstories and the tragedies of different characters, but strangely, another weird choice I think they made with this show was to skirt two big moral quandaries that come up in the midst of the plot of the show. Now, these are two somewhat major plot points, so if you haven't seen Picard, you may want to skip this part or go finish the show, come back and finish the review later, because from here on out, I'm going to get more and more into major plot points from the show. The first plot point that I think they really skate over is Dr. Girardi's murder of Bruce Maddox. Now, we find out the why behind it, but after that, they don't really follow through on that. We see that she certainly regrets it, and some of the characters kind of wag their fingers and say, shame on you. But Star Trek is a universe where if you take an action like that, even an action that you believe is justified, you're going to spend a long time going into the consequences of that action. I hope as we go into season 2 of Picard that they revisit that and that we see more of the toll that that takes on that character, because that is real grief and that's real trauma. That's not stuff that you have to talk about in an exposition scene that happened years ago that you just see the after effects of. This is something that you saw happen in real time, and I hope that they decide to visit that again in the future of the show. Another big event that I think could have taken up either an entire episode or certainly a big chunk of an episode was the decision that 7 of 9 had to make about whether or not to commandeer the Borg cube. When they brought this in, I actually thought, Oh, this is a classic Trek moral quandary.
Assimilate them, invade their minds, suppress their identities, enslave them. Again.
It's kind of similar to what Captain Picard had to face when we first encounter Hugh. In this show, he's the leader of the ex-Borg. He's also trying to rehabilitate them to bring them back to normal life. When we first meet him, Captain Picard is faced with a similar quandary about whether or not to return Hugh to the Borg Collective with a program that could essentially exterminate the Borg, or to allow him to live life as a sentient being.
If you are going to use this person to destroy his race, you should at least look him in the eye once before you do it. Because I am not sure he is still a Borg.
Instead of really delving into this, which I think could have made a very compelling part of an episode, this is a story beat that's essentially over in 3 minutes. 7 of 9 kind of goes for about 30 seconds, and then she connects to the ship, and then all of the Borg are essentially vented out into space. And then she just kind of disconnects, and it's never mentioned again. And I thought this is a real missed opportunity to go into this character's psyche, to go into her consciousness, and to really establish what her boundaries were. Instead, it was just kind of an empty action spectacle, and then we go on to the next thing, and a lot of the next thing is just more mythology building that, yes, takes up time and adds layers of complication to the show, but it doesn't really serve the overall story. My biggest problems with the show came as we got to the end, when Picard finds the synth colony, and then you start introducing things like Noonien Soong's long-lost son, who I love Brent Spiner, and I love bringing him into the fold in any way possible, but you know, Noonien Soong's whole thing was that his androids were his children, Data and Lore were his children. So to sort of add this long-lost child coming in out of nowhere, again, I think there's a way that you could have done it, but it was basically just Brent Spiner walking up into camera and going like, "Hello, I'm Noonien Soong's lost son. Shall we talk about androids?" It just wasn't set up properly. Something else that got to me was a repetition of a problem that I actually had with Star Trek Into Darkness, which was this cop-out thing where you kill the lead character, but then you basically resurrect him through a method that essentially in both universes solves death forever. You now have this technology that will allow scientists to build a synthetic body. You can map everyone's brain patterns and just put it into that body. And yes, they gave Picard one that's going to sort of degenerate over the next 10 to 12 to 20 years, and he'll live a natural lifespan, but they specifically say they added that as programming. They've essentially solved death now, both in the Kelvin timeline and now in this timeline. I don't like the fake emotional stakes. I knew that Picard wasn't dead. You knew he was going to bring him back. And again, this just seemed like a time waster to try to wring some emotion that wasn't necessarily earned, instead of putting some dramatic heft to something that happens in the show. Speaking of unearned, can we talk for a second about how they just kind of drop in there at the end that Raffi and 7 of 9 are an item now? I mean, listen, I have no problem with Raffi and 7 of 9 being together. It's just the fact that the show, and I went back and tried to confirm this, really doesn't set that up at all. Like not even a little bit, like not even subtly. I think they might have only spoken to each other like one time through the entire show. And then at the end, you just kind of have this camera thing and they're just holding hands and they're together. I don't mind that they're together, but listen, if at the end of Star Trek Insurrection, Riker and Worf just start hardcore making out, I'm happy for him, but you gotta show me how you got there. You gotta connect the dots for me, because otherwise I'm just gonna be going, what are these two doing? They would make beautiful babies, though. And then there's Data, and I was kind of mixed on this idea that, you know, Data's not really dead because his positronic ions are floating around in space, but again, this is really used to continue the work, not to rebuild Data. And then we get to this odd kind of Harry Potter meeting with Picard where they're in a quantum simulation and it actually is Data and his consciousness is alive. But again, if it was just that meeting, if this was just a way for Captain Picard to say goodbye to his old friend, then I'll grant it to you. I was still on board. But how they deal with Data, I think sort of is, again, in a nutshell, how this show deals with emotion and the outlook of Star Trek overall tonally, and how sometimes those two things don't mix together. Because the end of Star Trek Nemesis dealt with Data's death in a very optimistic way. Yes, Data has died, he sacrificed his life, but the end of the movie is really this hope that with B4 and the fact that he remembers the song that Data was singing earlier in the film, that Data might live on in B4, that his spirit will continue, and that Captain Picard hasn't truly lost this friend of his, that there's hope that he might still be around. In this show, we learned that not only did Data live on, but that he doesn't want to live on anymore.
When you leave, I would be profoundly grateful if you terminated my consciousness.
It's another way of wringing cheap emotion out of people in my mind. I was perfectly happy with the resolution of Data being that the Data that we knew did die, and that a piece of him lived on, and that the B4 would not be Data exactly, but that a little part of that soul would continue in this new creation.
Data tried to download the contents of his neural net into B4 just before his death. Almost all of it was lost. Ultimately, B4 wasn't much like Data at all.
Our goodbye to Data is literally watching him grow old and fade away on this couch. There's not a lot of optimism in that for me. As a matter of fact, it's very final. It basically is a confirmation that everything you knew and loved about Data is gone forever. And I think that's where that sort of tonal difference for me strikes. On the one hand, with Star Trek Nemesis, even though that was not a good movie, you had a very hopeful end to Data's life cycle. And on the other hand, with Star Trek Picard, you have a very sad, almost melancholy end. It just doesn't ring as true to me, and it doesn't seem as true to the spirit of Star Trek. Now, I know that the spirit of Star Trek is a very subjective thing, and I certainly have my idea what it is. Your idea of it may be different. But I think this is what the show is going to have to struggle with as it goes back and forth. But in the spirit of optimism, I will also say that there's one conversation in the show that I think does beautifully sum up what Star Trek has always been about, and it's about hope and optimism versus fear.
The past is written, but the future is left for us to write, and we have powerful tools, Rios. Openness, optimism, and the spirit of curiosity. All they have is secrecy and fear.
I think that is a great message of hope at its core. And as we go forward into season 2 and reportedly perhaps even season 3 of this show, with the new crew established, with Picard revitalized, I hope that the future of the show hews a little closer to that message of hope and optimism, that perhaps the dark days are behind us and we can go now toward building from this darkness what the future will be. I would love to see Captain Picard and 7 of 9 become advocates for the ex-Borg. I think that's a great concept that they've established, that there is basically a race of people that are untouchable, that nobody wants in the galaxy now. These people that were assimilated by the Borg and only want to now be re-assimilated into society. I would love to see the show refocus on 7 of 9 and Picard, both of whom have very unique perspectives on what it's like to be in the Borg collective and make their way back to humanity, and watching their struggle as they try to build a galaxy that is more perfect, that is more hopeful. Of course, then I'm sure something's going to blow up, or there's going to be a spy, or Picard will have to team up with like Guinan and Captain Sisko to fight the Ghost of Lore or something. That's probably closer to what we're going to get, but hey, a guy can hope, right? Thanks so much for watching this review of Picard Season 1. As always, I really appreciate you watching, liking, subscribing as we try to launch this new channel. Also, don't forget I have my Patreon set up at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. A lot of cool stuff there if you want to go check that out. I would love to have you on board. And thanks again for watching my personal trek through Picard. Hailing frequencies are closed.